want a debate today that's clear, that's clean, and where there are clear clashes on both sides of the house. The general clash that we believe will form in today's debate is whether we want a democracy or democratic-leaning government that may have ineffective policies at times, versus a far more efficient autocratic-styled government that relies on democratic vote. And we're going to tell you three principal reasons why this is important, particularly within nascent democracies. So firstly, I'm going to tell you like the difference between a populist and a strongman. Secondly, I'm going to tell you why having a president that fundamentally focuses on the common man in these nascent democracies is important as opposed to elite institutional power. And thirdly, we're going to tell you why the procedures of democracy are far more important than the direct actions within a specific democracy, right? So firstly, what we believe a populist is someone like Julius Malema. What do we mean by this? We mean that this is a sort of individual who has a direct incentive on gaining majority vote, who gets his power primarily from the demos, or the population of a nation, and he may have like ineffective, quirky, or strange policies at times, but fundamentally he's got a direct incentive in preserving the power and the institutions of democracy at the end of the day. Alternatively, people who are strongmen are people like Donald Trump. These are people like the current president of the Philippines. These are people like Erdogan. These are people like Vladimir Putin in Russia. These people are very good in the short term at in enacting like radical reforms. These are people who are very confrontational. These are people who are generally fairly ideological. They believe that in the short term they can be effective, but they're generally technocratic and they're generally illiberal. We can tell you why populism is generally beneficial, but firstly I'm going to characterize this by explaining why it's important to focus on the common man in post-conflict societies. Three reasons. One, the common men were primarily the victims of the conflict in the first place. So if you want them to buy into the institution of the state, what you have to do at the end of the day is you have to empower them and you have to give them a stake in this new state in the very first place. You have to tell them that they've got control, you have to tell them that they've got power, so that they don't pick up guns again to go in and carry on the fight. Secondly, these common men are disproportionately the cannon folder and the soldiers within these governments. So it's particularly important to empower these individuals to prevent them and to decrease their incentives from going back into conflicts in the next place. Thirdly, we believe it's particularly important to make sure we have as many stakeholders in democracies as important, which is one of the reasons why, right, the IFP tried to boycott the 1994 elections in the very first place, because they thought this would damage the democracy. By focusing on a government, by empowering as many people as possible, you make a democracy stronger by having as many stakeholders as possible. But Dave, for clarity, please.
Would you agree that often populist leaders are one who derive their legitimacy from having succeeded in a struggle, and they continue to have that legitimacy independent of whether they help their people or not?
Yeah, the reason why we say this is fundamentally good, and why we like post-liberation states in Africa, states like Namibia, states like Botswana, states like South Africa, right? Why? Because as the ANC and SWAPO came into power in post-conflict South Africa, their broad-based support and the fact that they'll remain in government for a while means what? It means that they fundamentally have a direct incentive empowering the institutions of democracy. So they will always make sure that the institutions of democracy allow for competitive voting, which is why, because of their this is why they tend to lose power after a while in many, like in our municipal elections. But we think it's really beneficial at the end of the day because they buy into the principle of democracy at the end of the day. And Botswana and South Africa have been a lot more successful than strongman states such as like Nigeria or places like Turkey, where fundamentally they have the illusion of peace at the end of the day. So we want to talk about how the procedures of democracy are particularly important in today's debate. So we believe in states that states have a form of institutional memory to them. So we also have to talk about how power changes within these societies. So they've just come from a period where the primary form of power change has been through violence. We believe that rather, if the vast majority of people believe that it's cool if the power changes through the vote, what that means at the end of the day is that when that party eventually does make egregious offenses in the future, you have like a strong form of state and nation building at the end of the day. We believe you have to have a coherent state that everyone buys into long before you have a state that has the capacity to make really effective policies at the end of the day. We believe that people don't buy into the state in the very first place. Long term down the road, you don't have the capacity to buy into these areas at the end of the day. This is why leaders such as Nkwame Nkrumah in Ghana, very strongman leaders, very popular leaders at the end of the day, they have the capacity to be popular. There is a difference between popular and populist. We believe that what they've done, though, is by breaking down the institutions of democracy, those countries have a lot less long-term growth at the end of the day. So we like to characterize the importance of long-term versus short-term, and we think this is an important clash within today's debate. We also like to believe that these individuals are far more relatable, and they allow people to believe that this is the legitimate way in which power transfers within a nation. So by empowering these nascent democracies, that the way to change power is through the common vote, even if the leader happens to be a buffoon, it's about getting the point of a democracy is about getting bad leaders out rather than having good leaders come in. This is why states like Rwanda that are run by Paul Kagame are great now, but they've fundamentally destroyed the institutions of democracy, and it's very difficult to find someone to replace them at the end of the day, which means that long term they're a lot more unstable. Leaders such as Erdogan in Turkey, they suffer things like coups, because there's very little way in which opposition has the ability to actualize itself. We believe the fact that there was a strong, stable ANC that continued to run South Africa meant that political parties such as the UFH and the DA bought into the democratic process, one, and secondly, they had the power to consolidate over a long period of time, because it's necessary that when power does change, it'll be at the end of the day. So we believe it's far more better to have a populist government which people buy into than a strong government that has a lot of risk that can fall into conflict a bit later. Because Emma's going to do some analysis showing why strongman leaders are far more prone to conflict, and they're far more likely for these nascent, fragile democracies to fall back into conflict. So having a weak democratic leader is a lot worse than having a civil war, and we'll show you why even the risk of a civil war is worth the cost of maybe having an efficient individual in power. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Prime Minister. Now to start the case for the opposition bench, I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition. Here.
Individuals in these nascent democracies are in a unique position that what they need is they need fast results. They need for the process from being liberated from their struggles to be fast, but further working at their need for there to be an establishment of a legitimate framework of governance that is going to be legitimate for the long run. And we're going to be showing you in opening opposition today 3 arguments and 3 reasons why we'd much rather prefer having the strongman technocrat as opposed to the common man populist. The first one is going to be development outcomes, and we're going to be showing you why the outcomes of development for those nations are better under our model. The second one is going to be legitimacy, and we show you why a framework for legitimacy is far more established under our model. And then the last one is going to be about the conflict post-transition and how we actually minimize that conflict. And within that, I'll be integrating my rebuttal. So firstly, in terms of development outcomes, what we need to understand here is that these countries are in a position in which they need rapid development. They need for people to be uplifted from poverty. They need for a lot of reconstruction to be there in their economies. They need the need for reconstruction in the societies as well. I think it's very important that we recognize that the kind of leader that we have is particularly important in terms of how we're going to be able to achieve these outcomes. So 2 reasons why the strongman is going to be better for development outcomes. The first reason is that the strongman is better able to engage with the necessary stakeholders. The first one being the past elites, right? We think that when there's a strong man in power, they're more likely to be able to convince past elites, like businessmen, to prevent their capital from leaving that country. We think that's particularly important in terms of allowing that country to exist in a state in which there are enough people who are willing and able to ensure that things like economic development can exist in that country. It's going to be damaging to the country when you have a common man who they're less likely to trust in, less likely to believe in, and less likely to believe is going to be successful in terms of these economic development. So I think it's better for these nations in terms of the development outcomes if they have someone who's in power, who businessmen, who investors are going to trust and believe and be willing to keep their money within that country. And it's particularly important, and they ought to engage with that. The second reason is that they're more likely to engage with the international community in a way that allows them to continue to be involved. I'll tell you that actors like the World Bank, for example, are more likely to be involved when you have a strong man in power, when you have someone who you know has experience, has skills, and is likely to be implementing policies that are going to work in terms of uplifting the people, in terms of getting the economic development and economic progression that the conflict deprive these individuals of. I think it's particularly important that you put these nations in a position in which they are able to access the things that they need from the people within those countries who have things like capital, who have things like resources, but furthermore that they're able to access things from the international community. I think that they're more likely to have buy-in from the international community because of the fact that they can believe that this kind of individual who's going to be implementing policies that are going to maximize on things like efficiency, going to maximize on the goals and recognize the fact that these countries are in a position where they need to be developing, and I think that's important for these countries to be developing. Or I think that although you may value the fact that they were able to liberate themselves now, that's important, it's far more important in terms of what happened after that liberation for that country to develop. We think that efforts need to be focused on that sort of development because they have liberation, right? They have more freedom than they previously had. But what's now important is for the recovery. I think that the recovery, is far more valued under our model in terms of the economic development and the development outcomes that we have as a nation, because we think that we do need to continue to have capital in that country. We need the international community to support us, to be willing to give money from institutions like the World Bank, like the IMF. I think we're more likely to do this when you have a strong man in power, and I think that this is better for those reasons.
Yes. So people have just fought for their freedom, and now you're going to elect this illiberal technocrat to take that very same freedom away. What people are just going to go back into a conflict scenario. Your entire process of government is circular.
It's not circular. What we're saying is that the people had a civil war and they had no freedom, right? We're going to a situation in which the government prioritizes things like development over laboring on about the freedoms and the liberties that people didn't have. We think that there is still a significant amount of liberty in this situation. We tell you that when the definition of a nascent democracy is that they've recently come out of a civil war, we tell you that there's definitely a great incentive for the person in power to ensure that people do have liberty. We can concede that they won't have as much liberty as they would have under a populist government, but we tell you that these liberties are sufficient in terms of allowing people to feel like they exist in a country where they're able to do things that they would like to do, where they're able to self-actualize, where they have rights and are respected. And we think that this amount of freedom is enough, and this amount of freedom is sufficient in terms of allowing them to reach a status in which they could have more freedom in the future. I think that that's more likely under our model. The second thing we need to look at in this debate is legitimacy, because what they're trying to tell you in today's debate is that no, these populists have the legitimacy from the beginning, and that's a good thing, and they're more likely to keep legitimacy in the long run. We tell you it's a bad thing, because when you have legitimacy from the beginning, there isn't really a great incentive for you to keep that sort of legitimacy. Whereas if you're a strongman and a technocrat, you think that your legitimacy is built during your time in power, right? You build legitimacy along the process. When you implement policies that work, get people jobs, get people food, get people water, then you gain more legitimacy. When people can see that you are able to get things done, you have more legitimacy. We think this is particularly important because if this is what your legitimacy is contingent on, you're more likely to get these things done. You're more likely to get people the sort of development that they want. You're more likely to get people things like more freedoms. You're more likely to get people to be happy. You're more likely to get people to buy into your government when you're doing good things and when your legitimacy is contingent on you doing those good things and implementing policies that benefit the people. We think that you're in a better position to be more legitimate. But furthermore, we tell you that you don't have the ability to just shirk your burdens as a leader and just rely on the fact that you're going to have this legitimacy that exists historically and is never going to go anywhere, right? That's why the ANC continues to get almost 2/3 majority of the votes in every single election for the past 20 years. We think it's unfair of them to just say, no, you can wait 20 years and then suddenly start winning a few municipal elections. That isn't enough. We tell you that legitimacy is far more all these leaders far more accountable under our model when your legitimacy isn't just given to you from the beginning, but rather you have to earn it by producing results that people are happy with and the results that will make these people's lives better. Then the last thing we tell you is about the conflict post-constitution. And here we tell you that, look, we understand that these nations are in a particularly volatile state, in that they've recently come from conflict, they've recently come from oppressive times. But we tell you that the technocrats are more able to do things like make the necessary appointments, like negotiate with like military leaders and ensure that they stay in position and ensure that things go well in that regard, because they're better able to engage with like past elites. We tell you that they have more political capital in this regard to be engaging with the necessary stakeholders to ensure that the nation can continue. We tell you that they're in a position where they can minimize conflict, yes, but rather we think that this is a better position than under the populists, where you're more likely to get more conflict. Right? When you're reveling on the fact that you as a leader liberate them from freedom, it's less likely that you're going to be minimizing conflict under their model. So we actually tell you that under their model, you're more likely to get the conflict they don't like to see. So we tell you that it's better for development outcomes, it's better for legitimacy to hold people accountable for, and it's better for conflict post-constitution. Therefore, we oppose it.
Thank you very much to the Leader of Opposition. To continue the case for the opening government, I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
After civil war and intense conflict, after the 16,000 people who died between 1990 and 1994 in South Africa, we don't think that they can assume that it is better to have somebody who is willing to negotiate with the elites, with the past system of oppression, who perpetuated the cause for this turmoil in the first place. I am proud to propose that we are going to get more stability under our side, but more importantly, we're going to get a final solution to whatever conflict was there in the first place. Because we think that they are again committing the mistake where they say to new African nations, you can have democracy. Where they say to Eastern European nations after the Soviet Union, you can have democracy, but at the same time, you can't have what you want. Instead, we will impose these certain ideals upon you. But the first thing that we really need to look at, right, is we need to question whether or not a technocrat is going to come up with the best short-term economic solutions, because this was most of Valentine's matter. And we think, and I'm going to argue, that even if you got those short-term economic solutions, it still wouldn't help because of the instability that you caused. But let's ask whether you get that in the first place. So in the information slide, and as we can see with people like Devon in Turkey, what often happens with technocrats is because they're not relying on people's popular votes, they're able to impose illiberal policies. Because the thing is that when you do things that people don't like, you're going to have resistance. So you're going to have journalists writing critical things, you might have protesters being violent against your police in the streets. And so more and more you can impose these illiberal policies, which means, and this was in Devon's entire point, that you undermine the institutions in the first place. So that means that democratic procedures don't actually take place, but it also means that when you die, because there's no continuity, because you didn't have to appeal to the population that stays the same, no thank you, there isn't any stability within that country. So we would ask what happens to Zimbabwe after Mugabe dies. Nobody knows, because you are able to consolidate your power instead of staying within a popular party, within a group of people with a certain ideology who have been struggle fighters and have always been supported by the population. So we don't think that you can assume that technocrats have any incentive to do what's actually good for the people. But then let's talk about the fact that they're supposedly less emotional, basically. So they're better able to negotiate, no thank you, with the past elites, because the international community somehow respects somebody who is not pushing their own people's agenda that they fought for a lot more than somebody who's being a compromiser. Now here, we think that firstly, you're not solving people's problems, right? Because you've had a civil war to avoid oppression, no thank you, and to try and overcome the specific structures that have been there in the first place. So this I'm bringing to you, which is new, which is that you can't move on from a conflict until you've dealt with those past issues. So we think that many people believe that the ANC compromised too much, and you get more radical parties in South Africa, such as the EFF, even now, 22 years later, who are saying things like how they want to undermine the system that exists, which is a fair enough comment to make after the ANC compromised and didn't give people what would actually provide the correct solution. So it's very important that you actually resolve the conflict, because otherwise you are likely to slip back into it. So we don't think that technocratic help is necessarily better. But we also say, so then they say, right, let's assume that technocratic help does lead to better short-term economic solutions. Then they say that automatically gets legitimacy because people see their better economic environment, and so they think, okay, well, this government is obviously good for it. I'm going to say that they're never going to get to that point. But moreover, Devon told you how populist groups are specifically incentivized to reinforce those democratic institutions. Why? Because when they come into power, they were fighting a threat. So, for example, the ANC was fighting with the police, they were fighting with other parties. What gives them their strength is the fact that they appealed to people specifically. And so in order to stop those competitors and shifting into conflict again, they want to strengthen people's power because that is ultimately where they get their source of power from. But moreover, we would say that their ideology, that they often inspire to be consistent, like the ANC fought for democracy in order to get, they make fiery speeches in order to get democracy, and that means that yes, they do appeal to people's power a lot. People do need, and they do need to cater for it, because if they step away from that ideology, they get people like Pfotenhauer, a member of that institution, saying, this is against the first ideology that we had. We think that there is accountability. But lastly, we would say that in a democracy, it's perfectly fair for people to choose to have a government in power, which is similar to them, which gave them support within a struggle, which meant that they prioritized that over somebody who they significantly distrust. We don't think people are stupid. We think they understand the risks in both circumstances, but they are much more likely to trust a group. So much rather have a black party in South Africa after apartheid instead of a white party, even if a white party claims to have better policies. I'll take Dave.
Why do people like freedom? We think it's so that they can access things that they need to make their life better. That people are primarily concerned with education and protesting.
So we think there's a lot more that comes into freedom, and one of the most important things is identity and justice. Right?
Yeah.
So we think that even if you had an apartheid system which was much more economically viable than another one, the fact that you make people feel inferior is still there. And most of these systems have come from people who aren't just economically hurt, but who are also fundamentally as human beings being hurt, and that also inspires them to stand up, right? But the last thing that I bring to you is that it's much better to have any system, right, than one that is likely to slip back into conflict. And that's incredibly likely when you have an unpopular leader coming to power in a country that's never had democracy before. Firstly, because the common man is now distrustful of the system. There isn't automatically a democratic culture. So what that means is that that system has no legitimacy at the moment, but rather somebody can lend legitimacy to it. So in Egypt, we think that the reason people ended up voting for somebody like going back to autocratic politicians is because the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't populist enough. It means that they revert back because they're unable to give that system any legitimacy. We think the populists includes that. But moreover, you characterize these people as struggle heroes, right? Often. And we say that it's a problem when you exclude those struggle heroes from the system. That's more likely to lead to violence if they feel like they're being displaced, or they feel like their power within that country which they fought for is being threatened. So you're much more likely to get them who have control over the common man to actually resent it. So ladies and gentlemen, if you like democracy, then we would much rather people get the populist government, criticize them later, than get somebody who overrules them right now after enough turmoil already.
Thank you very much to the Deputy Prime Minister. To conclude the opening half, please have the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Mr. Speaker, we support some of the strongest democracies in the world, some of the strongest developed countries like Singapore and like South Korea that employed strongman leaders, unlike populist countries, for example, Indonesia, that are suffering massive turmoil at the moment. A couple of issues in my speech. First of all, a way up between development and freedom, and why we think development is a necessary condition for freedom being valuable, but also why it ultimately results in freedom independently. Secondly, I'm going to talk about development outcomes and whether we get them. Then I'm going to talk about legitimacy, which side best maximizes legitimacy, and I'm finally going to talk about dealing with post-transition conflict. So on the way up between development and freedom, they give us this idea that the whole point of coming out of a conflict situation is to create justice and to kind of overcome your oppressors. They ignore that economic injustice is a major form of injustice, which in many respects we regard as of primary importance to people. It is more important to access economic justice, for instance, accessing water and sanitation, than it is to access the ability to protest. Because you can't protest successfully if you don't have the economic development to begin with. That kind of freedom is meaningless if there's nothing that you can get from it. The reason we want to be free is so that we can maximize our interests. We don't have the capacity to do so unless we have development within our states, unless we can choose to go to school because there is in fact a school there, unless we can choose to get water, to choose to dress how we like, to choose to behave how we like, because those things are actually available to us. What we would say is that also development often leads to freedom in the longer term, because as people meet their basic needs, as they gain a greater level of education, they develop different interests, and then because of the way elites work, which I'll talk about in terms of legitimacy, they ultimately provide greater freedom in the long term. Let's talk about development outcomes. First of all, absolutely ignored is the analysis about why we need to deal with elites, both in our own country, so for example, needing to deal with the people who have capital, where we need that capital to rebuild infrastructure, to rebuild often democratic institutions to begin with, right? Because if you don't have the capital to establish transportation networks and education networks, then rarely being a populist isn't all that useful in helping people realize a good life. Additionally, it allows us to better work with foreign capital. The reason for this is that strongman leaders are regarded as more stable, no thank you, but also they're in a greater position to make deals that are reliable, because they don't merely have to pander to their people, they can use political capital to say at some points we're going to ignore the wishes of our people in order to do what's in their best interests in the long run. Things like in Rwanda, Kagame has been able to springboard massive development in the top 5 developing countries in the world consistently in the last 5 years of his ability to negotiate with international actors and truly uplift people out of poverty. Closing.
Dave, would you say that, for example, most of the African countries which came out of colonialism had strong men, or that they were populist? Is Robert Mugabe, for example, a strong man?
I think it's tricky to say in Mugabe's case. I think towards the start he operated more like a strongman leader, and then I think later on he's operating more on a populist platform in which he's deriving his legitimacy from having overcome that struggle. I think more iconic cases perhaps are things like Nelson Mandela, also somewhat a composition of the two, but in terms of the strongman components of being willing to compromise, no thank you, being willing to ignore in some senses the wishes of the people to secure a successful transition were the most important components of the few successes that we did see in Africa. Okay, so we think we've established that development is likely to be created better under our model, and that it's more important than the freedom they provide. We definitely ought to win this debate. Secondly, let's talk about legitimacy, because a lot of their case hinges on the idea that there's an absence of legitimacy under technocratic rule, and that ultimately means that the system breaks down. We think what you need to look at is the ways in which technocratic leaders derive legitimacy versus the ways in which populist leaders derive legitimacy. What we would say is that if you are a technocratic leader, you definitely have an interest in legitimacy, but the way that you achieve that is you provide order and you provide development, which is what people like General Park in South Korea did. That's how they gained legitimacy, and in fact ended up some of the most stable regimes in the world. What we would say is that the true way up is that the short-term legitimacy of a technocrat is often lower because they're not immediately pandering to people. However, in the long run, their legitimacy is greater because while we do think, no thank you, that populist legitimacy often ends up being sticky, and it means that people aren't willing to challenge the government often isn't willing to provide them with things that they need because their legitimacy is derived from success in a struggle, there is a point at which, no thank you, that ceases to be good enough for people, and people start seeing that they actually want development, and that isn't being provided by populist leaders. On the other hand, in the long run, as a technocrat, as you're able to show successes, for example, Lee Kuan Yew's policies in Singapore, that ensures great legitimacy, often greater legitimacy than populism. In terms of addressing conflict, they said people will be upset, no thank you, so they will rise up. We think the majority are likely to be relatively happy post-transition. The issue is how you deal with people who are remnants of the old regime. The ability to engage with the previous military, the ability to incorporate them within the structures of your new country is often absolutely important to preventing conflict post-transition. Additionally, often quelling protests is necessary in order to maintain order and in order to ensure that you're able to set up the minimum level of stability before then you're able to take those ideas seriously. Their idea is just that people are going to rise up against technocrats, but they failed to deal with what we said in terms of legitimacy. These technocrats are elected. People do want them to provide development and provide order. If technocrats are able to achieve that, which we think they are, then they can gain the legitimacy that opening government is so concerned with. We think it's definitely better for states to have strongman leaders and proud to stand for team tyrants.
Thank you very much, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Moving on to the closing half, can we please have the Member of Government? Here.
Panel, note that the majority of the case that you get, particularly in David's speech, is irrelevant in the debate today because many of the examples he cites are not post-conflict. That's really important to tell you what incentivizes people's desires and how they conceptualize themselves being free. Not just like a society that came out of a difficult condition and then had a technocrat, but a society that comes out of conflict and desires a different world and conceives of their freedom in a way that is particular. I'm going to deal with that specifically. First, I want to address, as our extension, the issue of justice pertaining to post-conflict societies and their transition. Secondly, I want to talk about the incentive structures of the strongman insofar as they pertain to the networks of patronage that he is the most likely to enjoy. And thirdly, I want to talk about the strongman's likelihood to be preoccupied with the international, to open their country up to the international, and how that impacts on most people. First, some of that. David tells us that, well, what we need to analyze in this debate is the relationship between development and freedom. And that, like, if people have development, then they understand themselves to be free. Well, if you think of a society, for example, like South Africa, where on the face of it, things seem to be like going well. It looks like there's really good development here. You don't even feel like you're in South Africa when you're in Cape Town. But when development comes via the structure of like opening up the country to internationals, persuading old elites, trying to keep capital, etc., it normally means that the majority of the people don't have access to that development. And all of the issues you thought you had resolved re-emerge and re-insert. In fact, the best example here is Zimbabwe, the darling and the basket case of Africa in the mid-80s, right? A country that looked great, had the best education system, etc., etc. But a majority of the people there were not able to access that development, right? Even where it wasn't as big a majority as you think, for example, South Africa was something like 24 million people are on the verge of falling below the poverty line. You realize that all of this analysis about development and its link to freedom doesn't quite work when people haven't resolved the issue of justice, right? Because overnight, white farmers were killed in their sleep, and that country plunged into nothing. And those international institutions up and left them to hang high and dry. So this relationship between development and freedom, while it sounds quite intuitive when David speaks about it, doesn't often work that way in post-conflict societies, more or less in my extension. Secondly, then, they tell us that, well, development leads to freedom, and this means that, like, people will eventually be free. But people who come out of post-conflict society, as I tell you, want to resolve the issue of, like, their wrongdoing. They want to live in a society where they perceive of themselves to be equal, where they perceived that they receive fairness, and that the issues of their past have been resolved. Had you instituted, for example, a strongman in Rwanda straight after the genocide, you would not have had the opportunity that you get via a small man who instituted local tribunals wherein people could feel that justice was being executed, wherein people could inform the direction that that society was going to be capable of taking. Now onto my first issue. We think we prefer the small man because the issue of resource distribution is very important in a post-conflict society. In that society, a lot of things have been damaged, a lot of institutions have been damaged, and there's a lot of dilapidation. We think a strong man who has come out of a conflict society, a country, for example, like Liberia that was wrought in civil war for a long time, or a country like Ghana, which was wrought in internal civil war for a long time, only produces a strong man who is a technocrat, educated, etc., only as a result of having been tied to the elites in that system and being tied to an expensive network of patronage. So that whatever development comes, whatever money you get from the IMF or any other international bank, whatever crumbs Sanlam or like post-Walland money in South Africa is circulated, only remains within that patronage system. It isn't one that is as effective as Dave tells you. It's one that means that there's a lot of nepotism and there's a lot of feeding into that system of patrimonialism, because that is actually where the strong man derives his legitimacy. Those are the people that made sure that out of a society wrought with violence and poverty, that person could emerge a technocrat. Usually that person distributes right back to those people. It's the thing that brought Kwame Nkrumah down. It's the thing that Kenyatta, the first Kenyatta in Kenya, was doing, distributing resources to the Kikuyus and not to the Luos or the other tribes of that society. Now you don't just have unresolved violence from the past, but you have a situation where people perceive that they are not being treated equally in that society, and you fester tribal conflicts, you fester sentiment against the elites, yes.
I see you have a hijacking of these resources, but the loyalist to that populist who doesn't believe...
No, they concedes that the incentive structure of the populist derives their legitimacy from the many, right? Also that like they're inconsistent because the many are inconsistent, and so unless you're going to suggest that there's something OO doesn't say, that's not how the incentive structure works. And then the preoccupation of the strongman, secondly, with the international is more about making things look good right now. Robert Mugabe, after the Lancaster agreements in Zimbabwe in 1980, was really preoccupied with like being knighted by Queen Elizabeth and making Zimbabwe look nice for the world, when in fact things were festering underneath. Then he would say South Africa is coming along to the same terms. We tell you that radicals emerge, but that they don't really have the capacity to take real power. But what they do is to distribute a sentiment of dissatisfaction, where people look back and say, we didn't get the land. And you have the same crisis that Zimbabwe had when they killed everybody, and it was a bloodbath and a shit show over there. So this preoccupation with the international actually removes the development, the care from the people, and when they don't perceive themselves to be free, when they don't perceive themselves to be a part of that society, they are more likely to fight, they are more likely to go back into that violence. I've never been prouder to go through this.
Thank you very much to the member of government. Now to start the case for the closing opposition, I'd like to invite the member of the opposition. Here.
We must want to ask.
Thank you. Opening opposition is right to say that development is important in the reconstruction of post-conflict societies. However, it's not necessarily true that states relapse back into conflict and collapse solely because of development, but we say most importantly because of an unentrenched legitimate democratic system, an unentrenched legitimate democratic system, a failing collective national unity that champions a nation building that is based on inclusion and not on a contestation of legitimacy to the state and identification with a populist who doesn't necessarily represent their views. It is important to acknowledge that the challenge that faces post-conflict states is one of rigorous reimagination, reconstruction, redevelopment, and most importantly, a new, sustainable democratic order. Two things in extension. We're going to talk about why decisive and effective leadership is important and how we only get this from the strong man and not the common man. And we're going to tell you about how long-term democracy helps us escape relapsing into conflict. It is important to recognize that these states are absolutely vulnerable and insecure. They have broken ties and wounds from internal conflict. They are marred by dictatorship. They have a marred democracy because of dictatorships who are out coup or something, and you currently have terrorists and a hijacking of the state. You also have a broken economy, which opening opposition spoke about. So we think the most important consideration to make in this debate is the kind of leadership that is going to restore that order, restore that democracy, and how we can sustain that, as well as an improved political image that can give them legitimacy on the international stage. Three things in response. Firstly, to opening government. They tell us that if you have a populist, you're supposedly going to have more buy-in into the institution of the state. We say no. In fact, if you have a populist, you're going to have less people buying into the institution and the legitimacy of the state, because while populists are popular, they don't appeal to 100% of the state. They appeal and pander to majority groups that can give them a 48% or 51% majority. What you're going to have then is a contestation of legitimacy by the state. You are likely to have a race to the bottom of people trying to out-popularize each other, trying to out-coup each other, as we saw happened in Libya, Northern Africa, and the Middle East after the establishment of those regimes. And then Emma also tells us that what you want is a regime of continuity. Actually, that's exactly what we don't want, because the reason why we probably end up in conflict is because we were stuck with a dictator. And if you think continuity in leadership is something that we ought to worry about, then you will get continuity when you have a democratic system that encourages political parties to run on manifestos that prioritize policy and that don't necessarily prioritize appeasing the people. So if you're concerned about continuity, you get it better on our side. And then Ati also tells us that no, the majority of the population does not have access to that development. It's funny, and we're in South Africa, and the majority of the population doesn't have access to that development because it is the ANC loyalists who are hijacking the redistribution of the money that we were supposed to have gotten as reparations from apartheid. It is evidence that that redistribution program has been hijacked by followers of the populists and not the rest of the population. Firstly, decisive and effective leadership. The common man is a populist. They're elected because they were able to appeal to a particular constituency, but it is important to recognize that this constituency does not reflect that entire public. So then people like have contesting claims. Is this leader representing me? Is this leader not representing me? Am I part of this nation or am I not part of this rhetoric? Perceptively, what you have therefore is a rhetoric of exclusion. You have those people who don't identify with the populists feeling that they have a lesser claim to that country. What you have therefore is a retrogression, a repeat of the interstate conflict with people thinking they are more South African, they are more Kenyan, or more Malawian. You go back to those tensions and interstate conflict that began the Civil War in the first place. This impedes the important process of nation building that is urgent in these countries, because then you don't have a nation building that is absolutely inclusive. And you say because the strong man is a technocrat and is informed by policy that appeals to the entire citizenry and not to the public, it is likely to be one that is inclusive. Yes, opening government.
Cool. So your entire policy is about transferring economic power back to the elites and making that they have enough Mercedes. How do you guarantee that the common man is not going to rise up against this injustice again?
I'm not sure I understood your POI, but we, like as I've already said, we don't think economics is the solely important thing in this debate. We said we want to talk about democracy and how we want to relapse into a post-conflict state. I didn't understand your POI, I'll ask you to respond. Lastly, how do we achieve a long-term sustainable democracy? We say that a democracy that is not entrenched and one that isn't representative of the will of all of those people in that country and the immediate needs of those people, but one that campaigns on the exploitation of people's emotions, is one that doesn't allow for engagement and interrogation. And this is exactly the problem that we have in South Africa. You have political contestations that are ran you have political contestations that rely on popularity and not necessarily on giving people material manifestos with which they can engage with. You have no critical interrogation of democracy, no interrogation of state policies. What you have is your opposition parties in that state are opposition parties who are also trying to out-popularize that other country, the other party, so you don't have engagement. What this means is you set the standard lower for democracy, because politicians know all they need to do is be popular. All that Jacob Zuma needs to do is dab once a year at the stadium and not necessarily consider what it is that the people in that country need. So it means that country itself is no longer taken seriously as a country that respects human rights, as a country that respects a robust democracy and freedoms to interrogate. We say because we allow for a transition of continuity, of a re-entrenchment of democracy, one that refuses to never go back again into conflict. We think closing opposition should be very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the member of opposition. Now can we please have the government whip conclude the case for the government bench? Here, here.
What closing government brings in today's debate is the analysis of the different characters that we speak of in the incentive structures, right? We tell you that the technocrat might be able to get the elitists on board, but those elitists have conditions like private property. They have conditions like not giving away the corporation so they can make it hard for that young black lawyer to go in 10 years later, right? These are the kind of conditions that come with having the capital stay in the country. We argue these are conditions that are harmful in the delayed reward community. Later on, people suffer. They can't get jobs. People don't have proper sanitation. We argue that this elite keeping or trapping mechanism that the technocrat has is one that means development is concentrated and it doesn't reach the people that need it the most. However, because the small man is popular, because his policies are communal and popular, because populism just doesn't mean you're well known, it's because you're well known because your policies are policies that immediately people buy into. That's why you're well known, that's why you're well supported. People socially accept your policies and they appeal to them. And we argue that's the trade-off we have to make, right, in today's debate. Right? We're going to analyze this debate using one simple question. Does the incentive structure of the technocrat harm the majority in the long run and in the short run? And the first thing I'm going to analyze is this idea of development because of the technocrat. So what we hear from open opposition is the idea that we need rapid development. We need it now, and the reason why we need it now is because people need houses and sanitation and so forth. We totally agree, right? But the problem with having, the problem with being able to keep the elitists in the country, the problem with having to keep the people that gave you allow you to maintain the education that you have means that the interests in which you serve when you go into that democratic government is one that is beneficial to those groups, right? The groups that are able to lobby behind you, the groups that are able to run a good campaign for you, the groups that are able to make sure that you get that scholarship at Oxford, the groups that are able to make sure that you drive that nice Mercedes car are the groups that you will serve when you go into government, right? No. Why? Because they condition you to serve them when you get into government. They say in order for you to be able to get this degree, to be able to get this capital, to be able to get the social capital, you need to serve us when you go into government. You need to be able to make policies that are aligned with us in government. And this is true because we see Mandela totally disregarding justice for black people in South Africa and implementing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we had to give white people amnesty, blanket amnesty, regardless of the fact that they killed, they murdered, and made sure that people disappeared in our communities. We argue that's the trade-off. When you allow the elitists to stay, you have to make sure that you pander to their conditions. And when pandering to their conditions, you immediately sacrifice things like immediate justice for the people. We argue these are conditions that are not fair for the new state right now, and we ought not to allow for that to happen. The second thing they tell us is the technocrat is an idol, therefore they're able to get nice funding from the international political economy. That is a lie, because that's assuming that the international community is a monolith, right? They have different principles. Maybe the West might not want to fund the common man, but the communist China will want to fund the common man because of the different ideologies that the socialist common man holds. What this means is that it's not just the West or the IMF that can give funding, it's the BRIC, right? Is it BRIC? That bank is able to give funding to the social, to the common man. So this idea that you only get funding only when you have technocrats is a lie, because there are other institutions that are owned by countries that own different ideologies that could fund you. So we get funding nonetheless, whether or not it's in a world where it's not a technocrat, we get the funding, because this common man is viewed as a socialist. This common man is viewed to stand for the many. We argue that's a benefit as well. The second thing that they tell us, right, is the idea that, well, economic justice is important. Again, actually rebuts this and gives an extension and says, most of the time, this economic justice is not to the people that deserve it the most. It is concentrated in creating safety nets for the rich. It is concentrated in creating thank you rewards for the rich. We argue this it's not widespread and it doesn't go down to the people who need it the most. And we argue we would not make that trade-off and take them. The second thing that Athinangamso tells you about is the idea that justice is important. When when you're wounded and when you've seen your mother literally killed in front of you, the ability to look your the killer in the eye, the ability to sit down and tell him that I didn't like what you do and get retribution is not achieved with the technocrat, because the technocrat wants to impress the international community by making it seem as if the country is peaceful and there's nothing going on. They blanket the tensions within the country so they can get the West to give them more money. In a world where the technocrat is able to sell the justice of the people on the ground in order to impress the international community and to impress the international community by making the country by making sure that the country is perceived as peaceful, means in the long run people are still angry. And that's why even today black people don't like white people, because there was no justice for them in the immediate effect after apartheid. So with the technocrat, you compromise the idea of immediate justice, and then tensions rise later on. And then tensions rise later on when they realize that, oh my God, this was pseudo-freedom. Oh my God, this was pseudo-economic development. When they can't make it into that firm, when they can't get a social upward mobility, because all the firms are owned by racist white men who don't like their people, right? So lastly then, you need to ask yourself in this debate two things, right? What is the nature of a technocrat, right? What informs their incentive structure? And we argue what informs their incentive structure is the ability to serve the people that put them there in the first place. Comparatively, the popular man is then, their incentive structure is changed because they are encouraged to serve the many people that put them there. So comparatively, instead of having a concentrated amount of development, you have the scarce resources or the resources from China being distributed to a many versus an elitist small group. We argue that's comparatively better in a new state where everything is damaged, where the scarce resources or the little aid you get from whatever institution funds you is being distributed to the many, to the most people. Because that's why you're popular, because not many people like you. That's the comparative. And we argue, in a world where you do not prioritize justice, these tensions rise. And when they rise, you have Zimbabwe, where farmers are killed. When they rise, you have fees must fall. When they rise, you have continuous black Twitter hating on black people. When they rise, you have racial tensions and ethnic tensions. We do not prefer a world like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the government whip. To conclude this debate, I'd like to invite the opposition whip. Here.
That was a bit meta, because I think what closing government demonstrates in today's debate is how populism is the enemy of a well-developed state, or in this case, a well-developed case. So what I'm going to be talking about in my speech today is what these countries really are like, what it means when we talk about nascent democracies, and why the tie that binds the people together in these countries is a hunger for order, a hunger for stability, and that only strongman leaders can give them that. No, I'll be talking about a real comparative between strongman leaders and common man leaders. I'll be talking about international links and patronage. I'll be talking about freedom versus development, and I'll be talking about illiberal values, or whether we do really anything. I've got a lot of stuff, so let's jump straight in. We think these countries are fractious. These countries are complex, and these countries are multifaceted. Oftentimes, various ethnic groups are tied together with the most tenuous of links, and it's not as simple as pointing to South Africa in 2016, which is where most of the analysis on the government side came from. We're talking about countries in North Africa. We're talking about countries in the Middle East after the Arab Spring. We're talking about countries with a variety of ethnic groups, where the populist common leaders we're talking about are populist because they maybe have like 41% of the population and supporting them, when all the other groups only have like 20% and stuff like that. That then adds up to 100, right? Maths. But they don't really have like a plurality of the population. I'm not sure on the difference between the word majority and plurality, but fill in the blanks there, right? So I think what's important about that is, although they're populist, there are people excluded from the narrative of what it means to be part of that nation, particularly when this leader is playing on emotions and identity, but more on that in a second. What Rabodiba says is vitally important is that closing government is wrong in their framework of like these people craving for freedom, craving for like the rights that are denied under a more autocratic leader. What they crave more than anything is order, because what defined their lives during the conflict period was disorder, and that disorder harmed them. They don't want it anymore.
I'll tell you why that's vitally important in a bit. No, please sit down. So this isn't a discussion around the South African zeitgeist, even though that gets like cheers from crowds generally, right? So let's do a comparative between common man leaders and like strongman leaders. We think three important points about common man leaders that we brought up. Firstly, they're populist. Their populism derives firstly only from like the majority portion of the population, which isn't oftentimes like very many. There are many groups excluded from that narrative. And the populism comes from playing on ideas of identity, playing on ideas of emotion. What's important about that is that's the very discourse, the very kind of discussion that fuels the conflict in the first place. In areas that are like very arbitrarily defined countries because of like colonialism and the like conventions that drew up super arbitrary borders for Africa, for example, we think it's important that we don't exclude people from these narratives when in fact it's often prone to that, which is why it's important that opening government concedes that oftentimes these populist leaders are leaders from the struggle beforehand. What that should make eminently clear is that they're both that, and they're playing on people's like emotions, playing on people's identity. Your side of the house is the side most prone to fall back into conflict. We point you to states post the Arab Spring that have not yet achieved the democracy and the order they so crave when things looked so rosy back in 2011 or whenever that was.
Sure.
Let's compare this to the strongman leader. Please sit down. We think the strongman leader's primary identity, primary MO, I suppose, is getting shit done, right? Making some compromises, we concede, right? Like maybe there's less good press freedom or the ability to protest in these states. But shit gets done in these states, right? We think they are aimed at creating frameworks, aimed at creating like systems that people can then use later on. I'll talk about that later, about how that best allows people to transition into like the best case scenario, a more utopian sort of area. But we don't think it quite follows, and this is like super important, that just because they're based on like getting stuff done and their primary like MO is like order, that necessarily it follows that nepotism and patronage are inherent to strongman leaders. We think oftentimes that's often a lot more inherent to common man leaders. Why? Because nepotism is based on binding like identity, it's based on like those arbitrary links of like ethnicity or race that so often fuel nepotism. At the point at which that's true, we think the government side of today's debate is the side most likely to have leaders giving favors to their friends who maybe were part of the struggle with them, as opposed to the other ethnic groups that had less ability to fight in that struggle, for example. Sit down. Quick responses to international links and patronage. Firstly, it's ironic that Aji talks about access here, because on their side, they have a leadership based squarely on the rhetoric around identity and populism that not everyone in the state can buy into, because not everyone in the state is part of that populist identity. For example, they are part of the ethnic group that the leader happens to be a part of. With strongman leaders rather, we think their identity is sundry to who they are as a person. Their primary identity is getting stuff done. Therefore, it's far harder to link that identity there. Secondly, like, what does this international links like really mean, right? Like, you can't just throw around like the Western world and international links as a dirty word in debating. You have to tell me why it's a dirty word. On our side, we tell you about trade deals. We tell you about actual development. That's only possible if you have these deals. And we think these strongman leaders are best able to powerfully negotiate and not let their country get fucked over by the Western world, because they're the ones willing to take a stand, right? Like I pointed to round 5, or whatever round that was. Thirdly, we'd say, like, we compare South Africa versus Zimbabwe, like, maybe, like, South Africa didn't have the most woke transition, and that necessarily, like, we weren't doing, like, what people necessarily, would have wanted in that regard. But I'm certainly under the impression that South Africa is a lot more stable, and the ability for people to like necessarily like get self-determination, to get the things they wanted, for progress to happen in South Africa is a lot easier under Zimbabwe. That's why we're able to have these sorts of discussions now. I'll take open. Cool.
If the common man cares about order more than justice, why did they engage in the revolution in the very first place?
So that's a false dichotomy, right? We don't think that order necessarily is the enemy of justice in all instances. So let's talk about freedom versus development. That's nice. 3 responses. Firstly, we still have freedom on our side of the house. We still have a democratic state. Moreover, that state has strong frameworks and institutions because of the strongman leader, which we think means freedom is more likely to be attained. Secondly, your side is the side that is more likely to descend back into that very conflict, where certain groups were fundamentally deprived their freedom. With the common man leader, that happens because he polarizes based on emotion and identity. We need to ask who the common man is. Like, your side has far fewer liberties. But thirdly, at its core, development is better. The ideas we are imposing, again, imposition being used just as a dirty word debating, are trade deals that are beneficial. Stronger systems, someone who gets the job done. This means that the deep corruption and incompetence that are present when we have populist leaders necessarily sell people short. Finally, with the terms of illiberal values, we think that, like, on your side of the house, the contrast is actually best for us because populist leaders often have homophobic or sectarian values that we don't support. The values may be less majoritarian on our side, but that's fine. Like, for example, most people in South Africa didn't want the death penalty to be abolished after the transition from apartheid. We think leaders that like pushed for that were good, even though that went against the will of the people. On our side of the house, we give you the only true account of what these leaders look like and what people in the country want, which is order, and that these countries are fractured, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all 14. Let's give it a round of